and then decides it's time to intervene. And the best way of doing that would be a human sacrifice in primitive Palestine, where the news would take so long to spread that it still hasn't penetrated very large parts of the world. And that would be our redemption of the human species. Now, I submit to you, ladies and gentlemen, that that is what I've just said, which you must believe to believe the Christian revelation, is not possible to believe, as well as not decent to believe. Why is it not possible? Because a virgin birth is more likely than that. A resurrection is more likely than that. And because if it was true, it would have two further implications. It would have to mean that the designer of this plan was unbelievably lazy and inept, or unbelievably callous and cruel and indifferent and capricious. And that is the case with every argument for design and every argument for revelation and intervention that has ever been made. But it's now conclusively so because of the superior knowledge that we've won for ourselves by an endless struggle to assert our reason, our science, our humanity, our extension of knowledge against the priests, against the rabbis, against the mullahs who've always wanted us to consider ourselves as made from dust or from a clot of blood, according to the Quran, or as the Jews are supposed to pray every morning, at least not female or Gentile. And here's my final point, because I think it's coming to it. The final insult that religion delivers to us, the final poison it jets into our system. It appeals both to our meanness, our self-centeredness, and our solipsism, and to our masochism. In other words, it's sadomasochistic. I'll put it like this. You're a clot of blood, you're a piece of mud, you're lucky to be alive. God fashioned you for his convenience, even though you're born in filth and sin. And even though every religion there's ever been is distinguished principally by the idea that we should be disgusted by our own sexuality. Name me a religion that does not play upon that fact. So you're lucky to be here, originally sinful and covered in shame and filth as you are. You're a wretched creature. But take heart. The universe is designed with you in mind. And heaven has a plan for you. Ladies and gentlemen, I close by saying, I can't believe there is a thinking person here who does not realize that our species would begin to grow to something like its full height if it left this childishness behind, if it emancipated itself from this sinister, childish nonsense. And I now commit you to the good Dr. McGrath. Thank you.
Thank you, Christopher. Well, besides what you can read in his bio in your program, I should let you know that Professor McGrath holds two Oxford doctorates, one a Doctor of Divinity for his work on historical theology and systematic theology, and another Doctorate of Philosophy for his work on molecular biophysics. Here's what Publishers Weekly said recently about his work. Dr. McGrath has distinguished himself as a historical theologian and as a generous and witty writer who brings to life topics that would turn to dust in others' hands. We're especially grateful that Professor McGrath has traveled all the way from Oxford last night to join us for this evening. Thank you, Dr. McGrath.
Well, thank you very much indeed. It's a huge pleasure to be here at Georgetown this afternoon. Now, someone had told me when I was growing up that I'd be here at such a distinguished place as Georgetown talking about atheism, I'd have been extremely surprised. I think for two reasons. One was I grew up in Northern Ireland. Now, some of you may come from this place, but it's a kind of rather backward place, and the greatest annual event of my youth was the Donaghadee Donkey Derby. So you can see, coming to somewhere like Washington was just amazing. So, it's great to be here. But I think what would surprise me more would have been if someone to say, well, you're taking part in a debate about atheism, is I would have assumed that I would have been on the atheist side. Because certainly, as a young man, that was what I believed. I grew up in Northern Ireland, studying the sciences, wanting to go to Oxford to take this further, and it was very, very clear to me that the sciences disproved God, they completely eroded the ground on which faith stood, and of course there was violence between Protestant and Catholic in Northern Ireland. Therefore, my logic was infallible. No Catholics, no Protestants, no violence between Catholics and Protestants. So it seemed to me to be very, very straightforward. And certainly, when I went up to Oxford to begin to study the sciences in much more detail, it seemed to me, really, I had sorted things out and could relax for a while. But I found myself being challenged by a number of things. One was being challenged by beginning to read the history and philosophy of science and reading that the kind of scientific positivism I'd imbibed wasn't quite as straightforward as I'd suggested. And also beginning to realize, actually, that the evidential basis for atheism was much weaker than I had realized. And I began to find myself being excited intellectually and stimulated far more than I dared to think by the Christian faith. And so in the end, I came to faith, swapping my old faith of atheism for my new one of Christianity. I don't think I did so as any kind of wish fulfillment, out of any kind of psychological need. It was much more just a profound intellectual conviction that this was right, that this made sense in itself, and that this made sense of things as well. It was like someone, I suppose, who knew water discovering champagne. So for me, this was really a very significant event. And indeed, to this day, I still look back at my atheist days with great nostalgia, even though I no longer actually hold to those positions. And so it's a very great pleasure to be able to interact this afternoon with Christopher Hitchens. And I want to make it very, very clear that what he is saying today needs to be respected, and I hope I will behave respectfully towards him. I want to offer some points of disagreement, some points of challenge, some points of agreement, and also some genuine points of curiosity to try and get our conversation underway. And so I want to really focus on his main argument, which I think you've heard very, very clearly, that religion is immoral and leads to immorality, that in some way it is toxic. And these seem to me to be very significant arguments, very significant claims, and therefore I want to try and engage with them. I apologize to him, and indeed I also apologize to you, in that in the time available I will not be able to interact with him properly, but at least I hope I can begin to get this conversation moving forward. So an obvious question I found myself asking as I both read Mr. Hitchens' book and also listened to him speak, is that I think there are aspects of this that I'd have loved to have heard more about. For example, in recent years, especially the last 15 years, there's been a very substantial body of scientific research into the empirical effect that religious commitment actually has on people. And as someone who was a scientist and still remains wedded to evidence-based thinking, I wondered if this might actually come into Mr. Hitchens' presentation. To give you an example, if we look at Koenig and Cohen's very famous book, published in 2001, The Link Between Religion and Health, we find that the overwhelming body of empirical studies to look at this find a positive correlation between religious commitment and well-being. Now, that does not prove that there is a God, and certainly it does not prove that all forms of religion are good for you. I will gladly concede, because I think Mr. Hitchens is right on this, that there are some forms of religion that are pathological, that damage people. But there's a need, I think, for a real discussion about what is pathological and what is normal, about what is the center and what are the fringes. And that, I think, also extends to Mr. Hitchens' analysis of the impact of religion in general. He makes the point, and I think I want to say he is right to make this point, that religion has done much damage in history. I regard that point as being beyond contradiction, and it seems to me that every one of us here this afternoon needs to say that is right. But I think we need also to go further and begin to explore. And the kind of questions I would like to open up for discussion would include these. Yes, religion has done damage. But is this typical, or is this a fringe element? Who are the normal people? Who are the fanatics? And it seems to me there's a real need to try and make this kind of adjudication. I grant the history is there, that there have been some awful things done. But as Michael Shermer, who's president of the Skeptic Society, wrote in a book, How We Believe, some years ago, for every one of these atrocities, which must cause all of us deep concern, there are 10,000 unreported acts